Good evening, my night historians. Welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling back to one of the darkest, muddiest, and most miserable chapters in human history, the trenches of World War I. No glory, no polished speeches, just lice, rats the size of cats, and the constant hum of artillery waiting to kill you before breakfast. You'll experience a full day on the Western Front, from the moment the whistle blows before dawn to the haunting silence after nightfall, if you even make it that far. But for now, you're safe. You're warm. Before we start, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Feel free to leave a comment. And now, let's begin. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives before dawn on the Western Front. It is not peace nor even the absence of war. It is a held breath, a quiet so absolute it feels almost supernatural, like the earth itself is reluctant to turn, knowing what comes with the sun. In this pale, crepuscled hour, the soldiers rise. They do not rise quickly nor with purpose. They rise because they must, because stand-do is not a request but a ritual. At the edge of every trench across Belgium and France, just before sunrise, every man is expected to be upright, rifle loaded, bayonet fixed, eyes peering across the no-man's land that might kill him before breakfast. This tradition, inherited from old battlefield tactics, is a relic of cavalry charges and saber glints, laughably out of place among barbed wire and mustard gas. But it persists because dawn is the witching hour of wartime, when shadows blur and silhouettes deceive. If the enemy is going to attack, they will do it when your limbs are stiff, your boots are wet, and your body craves another hour of dreamless sleep. That is when you die easiest. So the men stand. They stand knee-deep in cold muck, their wool coats stiff with dried mud and old blood, rifles held in stiff hands. Their faces are shallow from too little food and too much fear. Some blink against the damp fog that creeps into the trench like a second enemy. Others simply stare across the horizon, watching the dim orange halo grow behind a ruined line of trees. No words are spoken. The silence remains unbroken except for the soft click-click of bolts being checked and the hiss of breath through clenched teeth. Somewhere along the line, an officer moves like a ghost, inspecting boots, checking for signs of trenchute. It's a grim little dance. This inspection necessary but futile. Trenchute is not a possibility here. It is an inevitability. The cold and wet are constant companions. When the skin starts to rot on a man's foot, it is not a surprise. It is merely scheduled. In this half-life, time bends. 5 minutes feels like an hour. Fingers grow numb. Thoughts drift toward home, but not sentimentally. No one is writing poetry this morning. They're wondering if the tea ration survived the night rats. They're praying the latrine isn't full again. They're hoping they don't get chosen for wire repair duty. And then, just as the sky begins to blush with light, it happens. A flare goes up somewhere distant white, light arcing across the sky, hissing. The men freeze, hearts quickening, but nothing follows. No whistle, no machine gun chatter, no gem, just a flare someone else's stand to, probably someone else's false alarm. The flare fizzles and dies midair like a dying star, and the silence once again returns. Then a voice calls, hoarse, and indifferent, "Stand down." And with that, the spell breaks. There will be no breakfast yet. First, there is scraping mud from duckboards, patching sandbags, refilling the latrine barrel, checking supplies, carrying up ammunition boxes that way like coffins. The war demands its chores, and the chores never end. But for now, for this moment, they have survived the most dangerous part of the day, the hour of dread, when the night deeds and the killing might begin again. And as the first true sunbeam crawls over the trench wall and spills across a helmet, the rats emerge from the dugouts, bold and fat, to see if anything human died in the night. After stand 2, there's no breakfast, no rest, and certainly no return to bed. Once the sky lightens enough to see the mud in full color, the morning routines begin. Chores in the trenches were non-negotiable. Each man had a job, and none of them were glorious. One might be sent to refill sandbags, hauling the same wet earth that tried to kill him yesterday. Another might be assigned to reinforce the parapet, the low sandbag wall facing no man's land. If the parapet eroded too much in the rain, which it often did, it had to be repelled quickly. A slumped parapet meant a bullet through the skull. Duckboards, the wooden planks that ran along the floor of the trench, were checked and adjusted daily. Without them, men would sink into the mire, sometimes waist-deep in mud, so thick that, according to British records, men occasionally drowned in it. Not metaphorically drowned. And then there was barbed wire. If the night had been quiet enough, a few soldiers would have been sent out under cover of darkness to repair the strands in front of the trench. That wire was critical, meant to slow down enemy charges long enough for the machine guns to do their work. But barbed wire patrol was also a death sentence. In one recorded incident from the British 56th Division, over 30% of wire patrols never returned. German snipers and patrols often waited for exactly this opportunity. So if you saw someone come back from wire duty in the morning, you gave them your biscuit. They'd earned it. Meanwhile, a different kind of horror stalked the men still inside the trench. Trench foot. Every morning, junior officers and medical corpsmen were expected to inspect the soldiers' feet. The process was clinical. Boots off, socks off, check the skin, look for swelling, blisters, or black patches. Trench foot was caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions. In 1914, during just one winter, the British Army recorded over 20,000 cases. If left untreated, it could turn gangrenous, leading to amputation. Officers were instructed to ensure men rubbed whale oil on their feet daily, rotate socks often, and elevate their legs when possible. Of course, in practice, with mud rising past your shins and socks soaked through by 6 a.m., this advice was laughably optimistic. By mid-1915, many regiments had established strict foot care routines. Men were ordered to remove their boots at least once a day, dry their feet, and change into one of the two precious dry pairs of socks each man was issued. The other pair usually frozen stiff on the dugout's drying line if the rats hadn't stolen them. The rats were their own problem, drawn by the stench of corpses and the endless of food waste they bred in the walls of the trench. They grew fat, bold, and fearless, gnawing on sleeping men's fingertips or burrowing into corpses, left too long in shell craters. In a 1916 letter, a British officer wrote, "One rat ran across my face while I slept. I punched it and it barely flinched. Still, chores had to be done. If your name wasn't on latrine duty, you were considered lucky. The loo was typically a board suspended over a deep pit, sometimes shielded by a tarp. More often, it was just a hole in the ground, behind a curtain of sandbags. The Royal Army Medical Corps insisted latrines be located at least 30 yards from the nearest sleeping area. But in cramped frontline trenches, that was rarely possible. So the stench hung in the air, thick, wet, and ever-present. It clung to uniforms stuck in your throat and drowned out the smell of whatever passed for breakfast. There was no bath. There was no clean water unless you were lucky enough to be near a supply depot. And there was no privacy. Yet in this swamp of decay, the soldiers shaved every day. It was an order. Beards made gas masks less effective. So each morning, men scraped dull blades across cold skin over water, murky with mud, blood, or both. It didn't matter. The enemy didn't care if you were clean-shaven. The gas did. There were two kinds of enemies in the trenches. The first fired rifles. The second chewed through your socks in the night and tried to nest in your rucksack. By 1915, British soldiers were no longer surprised by the rats. They were too numerous, too large, and far too confident to be dismissed as mere pests. They ran along duckboards in daylight, gnawed into tins of corned beef, and stared back with a boldness that only came from feeding off thousands of unburied corpses. The average rat in the trenches was not small. Soldiers often described them as the size of house cats swollen by weeks or months of feasting. The bodies of the dead, often impossible to retrieve from no man's land, were fertile ground. In official reports and personal letters alike, soldiers recorded scenes of rats burrowing into the chests of fallen comrades, hollowing them out from the inside. One British private noted, "The rats were big enough to fight the tonies, and they were winning." At night, the rats took over. They swarmed over sleeping men. They chewed through packs and boots. They bit fingers and noses. They were impossible to escape. A 1970 field diary from the Somme noted, "Last night I awoke to a weight on my chest. It was a rat soaked and reeking nibbling at the last biscuit in my tin. In some areas, men made sport of hunting them. Terriers were brought to the front lines not for companionship, but for extermination. A single well-trained dog could kill dozens of rats in an hour. Bayonets were often repurposed as rat skewers, but no amount of stabbing made a dent. By the time the sun rose, the rats were back, gnawing through food rations, scampering over corpses, squealing in the dugouts. French troops began calling them les funks, de la Buchilda of the mud. British soldiers called them trench landlords, or worse, our true commanding officers. Some believed the rats could sense when an artillery strike was coming. When they all vanished at once, the men would glance up, mutter a curse, and dive for cover. It often worked. The military issued no standard protocol for rat control. It was considered part of trench life, just another layer of misery atop mud, blood, and fear. Poison bait was sometimes laid, but it posed equal risk to the men. Explosives, while satisfying, were discouraged. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on vermin, no matter how monstrous. Besides, the rats always came back. They lived in the walls, in the floors, in the corpses, in the cans, in the sandbags. They thrived. If the rats ruled the trenches at night, lice ruled them always. They were the invisible enemy, ever seen in full, only felt. It began with a pinch, then a bite, then dozens, then an itch so consuming it turned even the most disciplined man into a scratching, twitching wreck. Lice, officially known to the medical cause as particular humanus corpus, infested every uniform. They laid eggs in the seams of wool clothing, deep where water and soap could never reach. The British Army issued each soldier 2 sets of clothes. After 3 days in the trenches, both were useless. Officers quickly learned to stop asking if their men had lice. They did. The real question was, how bad is it today? The lice were everywhere. They crawled in under collars, nested in armpits, dug into hairlines, and left behind red, blotchy sores. They didn't just itch, they sickened. By 1915, an estimated 97% of British soldiers on the Western Front were infested. The French and Germans fared no better. Entire regiments scratched in unison. But lice weren't just disgusting, they were dangerous. The worst of them carried a bacterium known as Bartonella quintana microscopic killer that caused trench fever. It started subtly, a fever, aching limbs, then headaches, then 5 days in your dugout, delirious, shivering in your lice-infested coat. The only warmth coming from your own rising temperature. It was rarely fatal, but it could incapacitate a man for weeks sand. The front line had no time for weakness. Between 1915 and 1918, trench fever affected over 1 million soldiers, particularly in the British, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The disease wasn't fully understood until long after the war. At the time, soldiers called it 5-day fever, or simply the misery. Efforts to fight lice were as futile as they were creative. Men chatted their shirts, that is, they took a candle and burned the seams to kill the eggs. It was a common sight. Grown men crouched over tiny flames, holding up their shirts like laundry inspectors from hell. If you saw a glow in the dugout, it wasn't always from a lantern. It was probably someone slow roasting his underwear. But even the fire never worked for long. The lice always came back. Hot water was a luxury, soap a rumor, and the chemicals available like neapoline scraped from mothballs smelled so toxic most soldiers refused to use them. They said it burned worse than the lice bites. Dousing stations were eventually set up behind the line's wooden huts with hot baths and steamers to boil the uniforms. But getting there meant rotation out of the front, and for most men, the war didn't pause for hygiene. One Royal Army Medical Corps officer remarked bitterly in his logbook, "The only creatures to truly thrive on the Western Front are the lice, and God help us, they may well inherit Europe." If the lice made you itch and the rats kept you awake, trench foot slowly destroyed you from the ground up. It began with a tingling, a prickling in the toes that could almost be ignored if your rifle was clean and you still had a cigarette. But after a few hours in the wet, the numbness arrived. And once the numbness came, the damage had already begun. Trench foot was the quiet executioner of the Western Front, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. It wasn't frostbite. It didn't need freezing temperatures, just cold, damp, and time. And in the trenches, time was the only thing that wasn't in short supply. The boots, standard issue leather, were poor armor against waterlogged ground. Rain, snow, and broken drainage meant most men stood in mud up to their ankles for 10 to 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. When feet stayed wet too long, circulation slowed. Tissues began to die. First came the whitening of the skin, then swelling, then the flesh turned blue, then black, then rotten. By the winter of 1914, over 20,000 British soldiers had been diagnosed with trench foot. Some lost toes, others lost entire feet. Many more continued to fight with bandaged, weeping sores, unable to feel their steps, but still expected to run into shell fire. Officers were alarmed and out of sentiment, but statistics. An injured foot was one less man on the firing line. So the Army introduced a protocol, foot inspections every morning. If a man was found with signs of trench foot, he was pulled out of the line, rubbed down with whale oil, issued dry socks, and given a day to recover. Whale oil repurposed from naval stores became trench gold. It was thick, foul-smelling, and almost sacred. Men were ordered to rub it into their feet twice a day. Sometimes a single tin would be passed between 10 men. If you forgot to rub, you risked amputation. If you remembered, you smelled like a rancid fishmonger. The irony was cruel. Dry socks were a solution, but there was no such thing as drying. In most trenches, socks were worn, then wrung out and hung up in dugouts where they collected lice and smoke. They never truly dried. Still, soldiers treasured them like talismans. Some tied spares around their necks to keep them warm or hidden from thieves. One diary from 1916 mentions a corporal caught trading a tin of meat for a pair of unworn socks. Nobody questioned it. They understood because once trench foot set in, the damage was rarely reversible. Gangrene would spread fast. Amputation was often done in the field hospitals without proper anesthetic. And if you survived the operation, you were sent home not as a hero, but as a man who lost a foot to rain. A few soldiers joke that trench foot was a gift from Garter. Take it out of the war. But most knew better. It was just another slow, painful way the trenches ate you alive. In theory, soldiers in the trenches were issued 4,000 calories a day. That number sounds generous more than most modern diets. But theory doesn't survive long in a muddy ditch. And calories aren't much comfort when they come in the form of a Bricard biscuit and a can of mystery meat older than you are. The British Army rationalist was straightforward, if uninspiring. Standard issue included 1 lb of bread or hardtack biscuit, 3/4 pound of meat, 4 oz of bacon, some cheese, tea, jam, sugar, salt, and if the gods were smiling, a tiny portion of rum. The meat was almost always bully beef tinned. Salted corned beef products so bland and greasy, it often congealed into a gray slab in cold weather. Even the name was sarcastic. There was nothing bully about it. It smelled faintly of brine and defeat. Men ate it cold with fingers or the blade of a pocket knife and tried not to think about texture. The biscuits known as heart attack were infamous. They were made to last, not to please. Hard as stone, sharp at the corners, and dense enough to damage teeth. Many soldiers didn't even try to bite them. They soaked them in tea, soup, or water for hours, or broke them into bits and mixed them with jam or condensed milk when they had any. One Australian soldier wrote in a letter home, "You could roof a trench with the biscuits they gave us. I used one to hammer in a nail." It worked. Sometimes the rations came with maconochie stew, a tinned mix of beef, turnips, potatoes, and carrots. It was best served hot, but it was almost never hot. One Australian soldier wrote in a letter home, "You could roof a trench with the biscuits they gave us. I used one to hammer in a nail." It worked. Sometimes the rations came with maconochie stew, a tinned mix of beef, turnips, potatoes, and carrots. It was best served hot, but it was almost never hot. Fires were forbidden in forward trenches. Smoke gave away positions. So most of the time, maconochie was eaten straight from the can, cold and gelatinous. It had a strange quality. Warm, it was tolerable. Cold, it was vile. Men joked that cold maconochie could kill a man faster than a shell, and yet they ate it because there was nothing else. Fresh food rarely made it to the front. Supply lines were long, roads destroyed, and the sheer effort of moving crates through the mud meant that the Army prioritized what could be stacked, stored, and forgotten. Tinned food became not just a meal, but a metaphor, uniform, bland, and seemingly endless. There were no plates. Meals were eaten out of mess. 10 small metal containers that also doubled as mugs, bowls, and sometimes shovels. Soldiers cleaned them with cold water, spit, or not at all. A layer of grease, dirt, and tobacco ash was standard seasoning. Hot meals were a luxury found only in reserve trenches, often miles behind the front. There, field kitchens might boil potatoes, bake bread, or brew large vats of tea. But at the front, you ate what you carried and hoped the rats didn't beat you to it. In the trenches of World War I, there were few luxuries, but there was tea. Black, bitter, overboiled, and often full of gritted, was still the one comfort that felt like home. The British Army issued 1/3 of an ounce of tea per man per day. That's about one strong cup if stretched. Water was heated in large kettles, passed down from field kitchens behind the lines, or boiled over makeshift braziers when officers weren't looking. Milk was powdered, sugar was rationed, clean mugs were a fantasy. But none of that mattered. Tea was ritual. Tea was warmth in a place where even your breath froze on your rifle. Tea was something to hold in your hands when everything else was mud, blood, or steel. A hot mug could raise morale better than most speeches. Even when it tasted of trench water and condensed despair, it was welcome. Men learned to share it, hoard it, barter for it. Some added a spoonful of jam to stretch the flavor. Others let it cool and gulped it down like medicine. And then there was rum issued in small rations, 2 Oz per man, per day army. Rum became the unofficial fuel of the Western Front. It wasn't the sweet kind, it was Navy strength. Nearly 70% alcohol by volume and stored in stoneware jars stamped SRD, short for service rum, diluted. The men joked it meant seldom reaches destination. It was usually handed out at Stand 2 just before dawn patrol. A splash in a tin cup, a brief burn in the throat, then silence, then orders. It didn't make anyone brave, but it made some men steady their hands. Rum was also used as medicine. Soldiers with trench fever, influenza, or shell shock were often given a double measure. Doctors wrote prescriptions for it. Chaplain quietly endorsed it. Generals, well, they issued it. Still, there were men who refused it. Temperance leagues had a strong presence before the war, and some soldiers stuck to their convictions. They were offered tea instead. No one judged them. Not for that. But behind the lines, when the colds crept in and the mortar started up again, the sound of a cork popping out of a stoneware jug could lift spirits faster than most prayers. And then there were the things they missed. Fresh bread, hot soup, apples, onions, real eggs, the sound of a spoon clinking against porcelain, not tin. Soldiers talked about food the way the dying talk about heaven. They described their mother's Sunday roast in loving detail. They reminisced about pub pies, streetcar chips, buttered toast, whole milk. Some even wrote down recipes. There are surviving trench journals with full menus. Imaginary, of course, like starter hot onion soup with crusty white bread, Maine roast beef with horseradish gravy and potatoes, dessert Tlaiyui tart, custard, drink beer cold and overflowing. This wasn't fantasy, it was survival. Because when your real dinner was a cold can of meat jelly, dreaming of marmalade toast kept you human. If tea was sacred and rum was medicine, then the latrine was punishment. Sanitation in the trenches wasn't a side note. It was a war of its owner daily, degrading battle against filth, disease, and the grim logistics of human biology. Each trench system had its designated sanitary area, a kind term. In reality, it was often a trench dug just for waste, usually 4 to 6 feet deep with a plank across the top. If the weather was kind, it might be covered with a tarp for modesty. Most weren't. They were known simply as latrine trenches, the Lou or less politely, the SHT trench. In a well-managed section of the line, the Royal Army Medical Corps instructed that latrines be placed at least 30 yards from any food prep or sleeping quarters, dug daily and regularly covered with chloride of lime to control the smell and disease. But in a frontline trench, those instructions fell apart fast. Mud made digging impossible. Shell fire caved in the pits, and when latrines filled up hand, they always filled up. Men were left with 2 choices: wait their turn or find a corner and hope the sergeant didn't notice. Violating sanitation orders was technically punishable, but punishment assumed someone had time to enforce rules while dodging machine gun fire and gas. The smell was indescribable, not just of waste, but of chemical disinfectants, Decaying flesh, stagnant water, damp wool, tobacco, and rot. Everything hung in the air. It soaked into the wood, the sandbags, the uniforms, even the letters from home. One soldier wrote, "The trench smells worse than death, worse because it lives with you." And disease followed the smell. Dysentery was rampant, and intestinal infections spread through contaminated water and poor hygiene. Symptoms: violent diarrhea, dehydration, fever, weakness. It could take a man out of action in a matter of hours. Some recovered, some didn't. By mid-W, the British had stationed ramped officers at nearly every section to monitor and disinfect latrines daily. But even that wasn't enough. Men used flickers, small wooden sticks, to scrape excrement from boots. They soaked socks in boiling water to kill bacteria. They were issued trench wipes, squares of cloth, or when supplies ran out, pages from newspapers, field manuals, or letters from home. No one laughed at that. Everything was fuel. Everything was disposable, even dignity. Perhaps the most absurd solution was the portable latrine bucket. In particularly tight dugouts, a metal pail with a wooden seat was placed in the corner. It had a lid. Sometimes the idea was simple. When the trench couldn't accommodate a latrine pit, bring the pit inside. Someone had to carry it out. That job rotated. The most junior men usually drew the short straw. One soldier recalled doing it in 1917. "During a bombardment, I held the lid down with one hand and God with the other. And yet, like so much in the trenches, it became normal, routine, even the same way they cleaned their rifles, heated tea water, scratched lice, and braced for artillery. Because war does not wait for comfort, and trench warfare least of all. No army functions without orders. But in the trenches of the First World War, orders didn't just structure the day. They dictated survival. Every moment, every movement, when to eat, when to sleep, when to climb over the parapet into the mouth of hell, was delivered from the top down, and the chain was unbreakable. The British Expeditionary Force followed a strict hierarchy from generals in faraway chateaux to field commanders, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, and at the bottom, the private soldier, the Tommy. Most men in the trenches never met anyone above the rank of major. To them, command came in the form of a lieutenant barely older than themselves, often from a better school with polished boots and a face that hadn't yet learned to flinch at the sound of incoming shells. And yet, his word was law. He was the one who decided if you spent the night repairing barbed wire or boiling socks. If you went over the top, in the next attack if you were listed as missing or left behind. Disobedience wasn't simply discouraged, it was criminal. The manual of military law was clear. Failure to follow a direct order could result in field punishment, imprisonment, or in extreme cases, execution. An extreme was subjective. Between 1914 and 1918, over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed by firing squad for offenses ranging from desertion to cowardice, striking a superior officer, or even falling asleep on sentry duty. Sleep, the most human of failings. If a man nodded off while guarding a trench post, something utterly understandable after 36 hours without rest, he could be tried and shot within days. The idea wasn't cruelty, it was deterrence. Commanders feared what might happen if fear of the enemy was ever outweighed by fatigue or compassion. So they made examples. One of the most infamous cases involved Private Harry Farr, a 25-year-old soldier suffering from what was then called nervous collapse, now recognized as post-traumatic stress. He refused to return to the front line. He said he couldn't do it. He shook, wept, pleaded. He was shot at dawn in October 1916. The Army acknowledged that Farr had been hospitalized several times for shell shock. They shot him anyway because the system required it. Orders could also be mundane: scrubbing mud from a latrine wall, carrying rations up the line, standing still in the rain during inspection. But even the smallest orders carried weight. A man who failed to clean his rifle properly might be denied leave. A soldier caught without his helmet could lose rum privileges. One man who forgot to shave during a gas drill was forced to clean every latrine in the section for a week. It wasn't about the punishment. It was about control. When the world above the trench was chaos: machine guns, mortar, poison gas, The world within had to be ruled with near religious discipline. Men needed structure or they unraveled. Orders gave the illusion of stability. Still, there were moments when the system buckled. When junior officers were killed, command fell to whoever was left standing. Sometimes a corporal led a charge. Sometimes a private crawled forward alone and returned with the only surviving machine gun. Sometimes no one moved and nothing happened, and the war simply waited. By late 1916, it became clear to many that their superiors were learning the war at the same pace as the men in the mud. Generals ordered attacks with incomplete maps. Colonels sent men into artillery barrages timed to the wrong minute. Brigades advanced into machine gun fire, believing the enemy had retreated because someone had misread a signal flare. One historian would later write, World War I was the last great war led by men who believed that courage could outrun bullets. But still the orders came. Advance 200 WWI and hold this section, reinforce the trench at Hill 60, stand by for gas. Dig a sap trench toward the forward wire. Sometimes they were followed, sometimes they weren't. And when they weren't, there were reports court-martial shows, field punishments. Field punishment. No, one was the most common. The soldier would be tied to a fixed object to wheel, a gun carriage, a post for up to 2 hours a day, arms behind him, legs together, head exposed to the elements. It was known by the men as the crucifixion. Others were sent to labor battalions, digging latrines for weeks under armed guard. Some were simply transferred to different companies. Their shame passed down through the ranks like a warning. Yet even within this machine of discipline, there were cracks of humanity. Sergeants quietly ignoring an order that would get men killed. Officers filing reports that blamed shell confusion instead of naming deserters. Privates covering for each other. Swapping names on duty rosters. Bribing mess runners with chocolate or cigarettes to buy an extra hour of sleep. Because no matter how rigid the system, the men inside it were still men. Some brave, some broken, all tired, and still the orders came. Long before a soldier saw the enemy, he heard him. The artillery defined the First World War more than any other weapon. It sculpted the landscape, dictated the pace of battle, and buried more men than rifles, gas, or disease combined. The Western Front was not a place of rapid-fire skirmishes and cinematic charges. It was a continent-wide orchestra of heavy guns, a soundtrack of distant thunder that never truly ceased. By the time most soldiers arrived in the trenches, they had already learned to distinguish the different voices in that thunder. Artillery had its own language. There was the slow, deep-throated boom of the howitzer, lobbing high-arching shells that plunged into dugouts and trenches like a god's fist. There was the sharper, flatter crack of the field gun, its shells screaming over the parapet with terrifying velocity. And there was the stomach-turning whine of incoming rounds of sound that started too high to hear, then dropped in pitch as the shell neared, finishing with a sudden and sickening silence just before impact. Most men quickly learned the difference between ours and theirs, not by sight, but by sound and timing. British and French shells had one rhythm, German shells another. Some soldiers swore they could tell the make of the shell by how it whistled through the air. And they were often right. It was not uncommon for veterans to develop an instinctive reaction, a crouch, a turn, a dizzy just from hearing a change in pitch. For new recruits, it was a brutal education. They either learned fast or died confused. The sheer scale of artillery fire during the war is difficult to grasp. At the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British Army fired 1.5 million shells in the 5 days before the attack even began. The intent was to obliterate German defenses, reduce barbed wire to shreds, trench lines to rubble, and morale to dust. But in many cases the wire held, the bunkers endured, and the defenders were ready. The result was devastating. On the first day alone, British forces suffered 57,000 casualties. And yet the guns kept firing. Some sectors of the front, like Verdun, endured continuous artillery fire for months. Between February and December 1916, the French and German armies collectively fired an estimated 40 million shells into a front barely 20 millimeters wide. Whole forests vanished. Villages ceased to exist. The ground was turned into a moonscape of overlapping craters and blasted stumps. One historian described Verdun not as a battlefield, but as a place where the earth itself was at war. For the soldiers on the ground, the barges became a permanent part of life. They disrupted sleep, conversation, and digestion. They triggered avalanches in trench walls. They collapsed dugouts, and they shattered nerves. Shells did not always kill. Often they maimed dripping arms from shoulders, legs from hips, or faces from skulls. And sometimes they simply buried men alive under tons of wet soil thrown up by a near miss. Men began to fear the indirect hit more than the direct one. A shell that landed on top of you was likely to kill instantly. One that landed nearby would tear apart your section, collapse your dugout, and leave you screaming for a medic who could not reach you in time. There was no pattern to it, no rhythm that could be trusted. The randomness was part of the terror. Shells fell without warning. A quiet scepter could erupt into bombardment without a moment's notice. In an area that had been shelled flat one day could be hit again the next, just to make sure. Even the air conspired in this horror. On wet days, the shells sounded closer. The explosions muffled, but more encompassing. On cold days, the cracks rang sharper. In fog, the flashes were bright but directionless, like ghosts fighting in the mist. Men huddled in dugouts that they half believed were their coffins. They plugged their ears with dirty rags, tried to sleep in shifts, and counted the seconds between bursts like it was a twisted lullaby. Eventually, some stopped reacting altogether. They stared forward blankly, lips moving without sound, eyes empty. The Army had a term for this, shell shock. At the time, it was poorly understood, often dismissed as cowardice or emotional weakness. Today, we know it as trauma. Still, they endured because they had to, because the shells never stopped. And neither did the war. Artillery was not a moment. It was a condition. It did not come and go like a cavalry charge or an infantry skirmish. It lived with the soldiers. It was part of the air they breathed, the ground they slept on, the dreams that woke them screaming in the night. Once the first shells fell, there was no true silence again. Not in body, not in mind. To live under bombardment was to live inside a storm that never fully passed. Most trenches were constructed with this in mind. The frontline trench closest to the enemy was designed to be narrow, zigzagging, and loafers meant to minimize the impact of shrapnel and flying debris. Behind it, reserve and support trenches held supply routes, field kitchens, medical stations, and what passed for relative safety. But even these deeper positions were vulnerable. Artillery had reach, and accuracy was at best theoretical. The average soldier quickly learned that no trench was truly safe. Artillery was indifferent. It was fired in patterns, in grids, in saturations. Shells didn't target men, they targeted areas. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time wasn't bad. Luck was inevitable. During a barrage, men dropped flat in the mud or fled to dugouts, timber-lined caves dug into the trench walls, reinforced with sandbags and corrugated iron. Some went as deep as 30 feet, but most were shallow, rushed, and barely held together. When the shelling began in earnest, men crouched in those dark holes, counting the seconds between impacts. The closer the blast, the more the earth shook. Candles flickered. Dust and splinters rained down. Men sat shoulder-tossed, shoulder-breathing, the sour air of unwashed uniforms, cigarette smoke, and fear. Some prayed, some swore. Some sat in total silence in extreme barges like those at Pestendal or the Sund. Explosions didn't come in intervals. They came as a rolling wall of thunder, overlapping, deafening. It was impossible to speak. Men communicated by tapping on shoulders or drawing in the dirt with trembling fingers. Outside, the earth itself changed. The soil leapt upward in plumes. Trenches collapsed inwards. Duckboards splintered. Sandbags tore open like sacks of flour. Men on sentry duty vanished under flying debris or were simply not found afterward. Sometimes the dead were visible, a boot sticking out of the dirt, a hand reaching from a crater. Other times there was nothing left to retrieve. Medical units quickly learned that most artillery wounds weren't clean. Shell fragments tore jagged paths through flesh, carrying mud, cloth, and metal into the wound. Amputation became a standard response. Even minor shrapnel injuries could become fatal if infections set in and in the trenches. Infection always found a way. But artillery didn't just wound bodies, it mangled nerves. By 1915, military physicians began noticing a growing number of soldiers who returned from bombardments physically intact but mentally altered. They flinched at loud sounds, stammered, twitched, or wept uncontrollably. Some couldn't speak. Others couldn't sleep. Some had to be restrained during the night to keep from clawing at their own faces. This was called shell shocker, new term for a new kind of suffering. At first, it was thought to be caused by physical concussions, the brain damaged by the percussive force of the blast. But over time, it became clear that even soldiers far from the immediate explosions suffered the same symptoms. It was psychological, it was cumulative, and it was everywhere. A British War Office report from 1917 estimated that over 40% of medical discharges during the war were due to psychological trauma. Most of it linked to artillery exposure. In France, similar numbers emerged. In Germany, the condition was called CISO war neurosis. And while some commanders treated it as a legitimate injury, many did not. Soldiers who shook or wept or refused to return to the front were labeled cowards. Some were jailed, some were executed, but most were simply returned to the line. The logic was brutal and circular. The only way to prove you weren't suffering from shell shock was to withstand more shelling. And so day after day, week after week, men crouched in craters or hunched in dugouts as the sky split open above them. They began to name the guns: whiz-bangs, Jack Johnsons, toffee apples. Each nickname a small effort to tame the horror. They laughed about shells that missed, toasted those that killed rats instead of men, and shared rumors of some mythical German gun that could fire 20 miles inland. They clung to superstition that the first shell never hit, that the third was the one to fear, that if you could still hear it, you were safe. But they never forgot. Years later, long after the mud had dried and the trenches were filled in, former soldiers would go quiet during thunderstorms. Some could no longer stand the sound of fireworks. Some never spoke of the war at all because the artillery had stopped, but the echo remained. There was no moment in trench warfare more dreaded, more fatal, or more absurd than the command to go over the top. It began with the whistle, 3 short blasts blown by a junior officer or company sergeant. It was sharp, unmistakable. There was no mistaking it for anything else. No warning, no negotiation. Once the whistle blew, the men moved, or at least they were expected to. The phrase "going over the top" referred to the act of climbing out of the relative shelter of the trench and charging across no man's land, that blasted barren strip of mud and wire separating the opposing lines. It could be 50 yards wide or 500. It might be clear of obstacles or choked with shell craters, shattered tree stumps, and the bodies of men who hadn't made it the day before. No man's land was never still. It was crossed at night by patrols, lit by flares, wired with explosives, and littered with the dying. But during an attack, it became a killing field. The assault was usually scheduled in advance, timed to the second with artillery pre-planned to lay down a creeping barrage just ahead of the advancing troops. Theoretically, the barrage would suppress the enemy, destroy their machine gun nests, and allow the infantry to walk in and take the trench. The reality was different. Artillery rarely destroyed enemy wire, and even more rarely knocked out all the machine guns. In the first moments of the charge, soldiers would emerge into a landscape that looked empty, but wasn't. German defenders crouched in dugouts reinforced with concrete and steel, waited for the barrage to lift. Once it did, they climbed back up, mounted their guns, and opened fire. The result was often slaughter. At the Somme in July 1916, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches at 7:30 a.m., confident that the week-long artillery bombardment had cleared the way. Within minutes, thousands were dead. On the first day alone, British forces suffered over 19,000 killed and 38,000 wounded. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history. The formations were rigid. Officers often ordered men to advance in line, shoulder to shoulder, rifles at the ready, packs on their backs, as if still fighting a 19th century war. The idea was to maintain unit cohesion and make the advance easy to control. But against machine guns that fired hundreds of rounds per minute, it was suicide. The machine gun was the great equalizer of the war chief. Efficient and brutally impersonal. The German MG-08 and British Vickers gun both fired around 500 rounds per minute. A single well-positioned crew could mow down an entire company before the men crossed halfway. And yet they went, not because they wanted to, but because the orders were clear. The whistle had blown. Men would throw their rifles onto the parapet, grab the edge of the trench wall, and hoist themselves up, often with the help of comrades. Sandbags gave way beneath their boots. Mud sucked at their legs. Sometimes they slipped back in, dazed or ashamed. Sometimes they froze at the top, straddling the wall, eyes wide. Sometimes they ran. They carried between 60 to 80 pounds of gear, rifles, bayonets, ammunition, water canteens, gas masks, entrenching tools, grenades, sometimes wire cutters or shovels. In deep mud, it was enough to sink them, literally. Men sometimes had to be hauled out of shell craters like drowning victims. Boots were lost, ankles snapped, packs were cut away mid-sprint. Still they advanced. Smoke from the artillery lingered in the air, making it impossible to see. The sun glinted off helmets. Gas sometimes drifted back over their own lines. And everywhere the shishima sound, rifles cracking, machine guns roaring, wounded men screaming for stretcher bearers who couldn't reach them. Survival was random. One man might sprint across 200 yards unscathed, while another died before his foot touched the top rung of the ladder. Medals were rare. More often, names were penciled into ledgers, tagged to personal effects, and reported back to families in quiet towns who could not imagine what the word missing truly meant. Sometimes the attack succeeded. An enemy trench was taken. Prisoners were hauled back. A small piece of shattered land was gained, and then almost always it was lost again in the next counterattack. The lines moved a few hundred yards in either direction over the course of months. Thousands died for every inch. To go over the top was not a moment of heroism. It was a ritual of attrition carried out because someone far away staring at a map believed it was necessary. And so the men waited for the whistle. Once a man left the safety of the trench, he entered a space that was neither his nor the enemy's. No man's land was exactly what it claimed to be: unclaimed, ungovernable, and often unsurvivable. It stretched like a scar between the opposing lines, varying from as narrow as 30 yards to as wide as several hundred. There were no clear boundaries, no signs, no paths. It was simply there, a tangled wasteland of barbed wire, craters, scorched trees, and rotting corpses. The ground itself was churned by months of shell fire, pockmarked and unstable. Entire sections were little more than sucking mud pits, ready to swallow a man whole if he misjudged his footing. Soldiers had to leap from crater to crater, dodging wire entanglements, ducking from snipers, and praying the next step wouldn't end in a detonation or a bullet. The terrain was shaped less by nature than by artillery. Millions of shells had sculpted the earth into grotesque topographies. In some sectors like Ypres and Passchendaele, the land had become so waterlogged that drainage was impossible. The British Army attempted to lay down wooden tracks, duck boards, and sandbag walkways. But these were temporary, often destroyed by the very shelling that preceded the attacks. According to war records, drowning in no man's land was not rare. Men who fell into water-filled shell holes, burdened by packs and rifles, sometimes couldn't climb out. Witnesses described hearing desperate cries only to watch the mud close over their comrades moments later. The horror was so commonplace it ceased to shock. Soldiers carried on, eyes fixed ahead, stepping over limbs and bodies like debris. Barbed wire was the next barrier. It had become one of the war's most efficient killers, not because it struck, but because it trapped. Defenses often stretched in belts 30 yards wide, layered with trip wires, entanglements, and hidden stakes. Artillery was supposed to destroy the wire before a charge, but in practice, it rarely did. Even direct hits often failed to sever all the strands, and any wire that remained could channel attacking troops into kill zones. Machine gunners knew exactly where these choke points were. Many men carried wire cutters, but using them under fire was nearly impossible. Entire platoon died tangled in wire, limbs caught, uniforms shredded, screaming as bullets found them. One officer wrote in his journal, "We were caught like rats in netting. We could do nothing but bleed. Machine guns did the rest." The German MG-08, based on Hiram Maxim's original design, could fire up to 500 rounds per minute. imp placed in reinforced concrete bunkers called pillboxes, often with overlapping fields of fire. They created what commanders described as curtains of lead. Any exposed advance across no man's land was met with instant suppression. Bullets tore through men in seconds, and the advance stalled before it ever reached enemy lines. Survivors dropped into craters for cover and were forced to wait sometimes for hours until nightfall, or until death arrived by shell or bayonet. Despite these dangers, some men did reach the enemy trenches. Those who made it often found themselves in close combats, abandoned in favor of grenades, bayonets, shovels, and fists. The brutality was unmatched. Unlike the distant, impersonal killing of artillery, trench fighting was primal and immediate. The confined spaces of the trench corridors offered no room for maneuver, no place to hide. Soldiers described the smell, blood, cordite, sweat. Excrement tanned the sounds, screaming, panting, blades, striking bone. The fighting was over quickly. Victory when it came meant taking a short length of trench, clearing it, embracing for the inevitable counterattack. The cost of even a partial advance was staggering. During the Battle of Loos in 1915, the British gained just under 2 miles of territory at the cost of nearly 60,000 casualties. The Battle of Arras in 1917 saw an advance of about 3.5 miles with over 160,000 British casualties. These were considered successful operations. In other words, a few hundred yards of crated wasteland cost tens of thousands of lives and often had to be fought for again the following week. And yet, despite the carnage, the ritual continued. Troops were drilled in how to cross no man's land. Fix bayonets, keep in line. Don't stop to help the wounded. Don't lose formation. Don't look back. Officers used whistles, bugles, and even handkerchiefs tied to sticks to signal the timing of advances. The instructions were simple because the outcome was not. What happened once you left the trench was out of anyone's hands. Some men ran, some crawled, some walked slowly, knowing they were going to die and unwilling to rush toward it. Others froze, collapsing mid-sprint, too terrified or wounded to continue. There are accounts of men advancing through gas clouds, coughing and blinded, trying to keep information. Others carried stretches, trying to save friends or officers. Some played dead for hours, covered in the blood of others, willing themselves not to cough or move as boots passed inches from their heads. For those who survived the crossing, no man's land never left them. Veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, how quiet it seemed just before the firing began, how the morning frost settled on corpses like snow, how flares cast dancing shadows on barbed wire at night. It became less a place than a memory, a haunted plain between past and future, between life and whatever came next. The first time poison gas was used on a large scale in modern warfare, it came on the wind. On April 22, 1915, at around 5:00 p.m. near the town of Ypres in Belgium, the German army released over 160 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders positioned along their trench lines. The target was a 4-mile stretch defended primarily by French colonial troops, including Algerian and Moroccan units. There was no warning, no whistle, no artillery horse, just a sudden strange mist rolling low across the battlefield, pale green and ghost-like, hugging the contours of the ground as it moved steadily toward the Allied lines. At first, the men didn't understand what they were seeing. Fog was common in Flanders, but this wasn't fog. It had a metallic smell, sharp and acrid. Some described it as similar to pepper or bleach. Then came the coughing, then the choking, then the panic. Chlorine gas reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, effectively turning each breath into chemical torture. The gas burned from the inside out. Soldiers dropped their rifles, clawed at their throats, and collapsed as their lungs filled with fluid. Death could take minutes or hours. Those who didn't die outright were often left permanently damaged, burned, lungs scarred, speech destroyed. The survivors fled in chaos, leaving behind a gaping hole in the Allied line. The Germans, unprepared for their own success, hesitated to exploit the breach. Their own troops had been issued only primitive, masked skos pants, soaked in urine or bicarbonate of soda, and commanders were unsure whether it was safe to advance. The moment passed. The line was eventually reformed. But the world had changed. The age of chemical warfare had begun. The psychological impact of that first gas attack was as devastating as the physical toll. News spread quickly through Allied trenches. The enemy had unleashed a weapon that couldn't be seen, couldn't be shot at, and couldn't be outrun. It floated in with the wind and turned air into poison. The sheer invisibility of the threat added a new layer of terror to a battlefield already saturated with fear. The British and French responded with outrage, citing the HEG conventions of 18 and 1907, which had explicitly banned the use of asphyxiating gases in warfare. But their outrage didn't last long. Within weeks, they were developing their own chemical weapons programs. Within months, they were using gas on the battlefield themselves. Gas warfare became a constant presence on the Western Front. Cylinders were buried behind trench lines, connected by hoses, and used when the wind conditions were right. Later, shells filled with gas allowed for more targeted delivery. The types of gas evolved too. Chlorine was soon joined and largely replaced by phosgen, which was even more lethal and less detectable. Then came mustard gas. First used by the Germans in July 1917, which didn't need to be inhaled to cause damage. It burned the skin, caused painful blisters, and lingered in the soil for days, contaminating whole sections of trench. Mustard gas was insidious. It didn't kill immediately. In fact, it was designed not to. Its true power lay in incapacitation. Soldiers exposed to it were blinded, blistered, and sickened. Unable to fight, but not dead. This overwhelmed medical units, stretched supply lines, and clogged up evacuation chains. One shell could render dozens of men helpless for days logistically. A brilliant, if horrific, tactic. Protection improved over time, but it never became foolproof. In the early months, soldiers were told to urinate on cloth and hold it over their faces. Uric acid neutralized chlorine. Later, proper gas masks were issued, canvas hoods with glass eye slits and primitive filters. By 1916, these had improved to include activated charcoal filters and better face seals, but they were still hot, uncomfortable, and prone to fogging. In the chaos of battle, many soldiers pulled them off to breathe more easily, exposing themselves to invisible death. Even with training and equipment, gas remained a wild card. Wind could change without warning. Entire divisions were known to gas themselves accidentally when the breeze turned. Some gas shells exploded too high, dispersing ineffectively. Others exploded too low, contaminating friendly trenches. And the constant presence of BAE made daily trench life even more unbearable. Men were forced to sleep with masks at hand, drill in them, eat with them, march with them. By war's end, it's estimated that over 1.3 million men were gassed during World War I. Of these, roughly 90,000 died of a relatively low mortality rate compared to artillery or disease. But the long-term consequences were staggering. Thousands more suffered for the rest of their lives. Lung damage, blindness, skin lesions, PTSD, rooted not in explosions or bullets, but in the smell of damp earth and the faint hiss of a drifting mist. Gas warfare never became the decisive weapon its architects hoped it would be. But it accomplished something else. It degraded the concept of the battlefield. It violated the idea that death had to be visible, that a soldier could see his killer. It turned the very air into a weapon, and in doing so erased one of the last illusions of safety in war. A gas attack did not begin with the bang of a shell or the rattle of gunfire. It began with silence, followed by the sharp, unmistakable hiss. Sometimes it came with the wind, carried across open fields in an unnatural green or yellow fog. Other times it arrived in canisters launched from enemy trenches, their detonation muffled but unmistakable. Still other times it was delivered via artillery shell, bursting just above the ground and releasing its invisible payload across the lines. In every case, there was no time to think. The warning went up in a cry, not a command. Gas, and chaos followed. Soldiers were trained to dan their masks within 7 seconds. In reality, it took longer. Men fumbled with the rubber straps, tore the eyepieces, or put them on backwards. Some had masks damaged by rain or rough handling. Others had none at all. Many were asleep when the gas came, jolted awake by a comrade yelling or the sting of chlorine in their throat. There are countless stories of men waking to find their dugout already full of gum. crawling toward the exit only to realize they were too late. Once exposed, the symptoms arrived almost instantly. Chlorine burned the eyes, the throat, and the lungs. Within moments, a man's vision blurred. His chest tightened, and a fit of coughing overtook him. It was a dry, hacking cough that quickly turned wet and frothy as fluid built up in the lungs. Breathing felt like drowning. Speaking was impossible. Panic was inevitable. Phosphine, which replaced chlorine in many attacks, was harder to detect and far more lethal. It smelled faintly of freshly cut hay or green corn, pleasant, almost pastoral. By the time symptoms appeared, it was often too late. Soldiers exposed to high doses might feel fine for an hour before collapsing. Lungs ravaged, unable to draw a full breath. There was no cure. Medical teams could offer little more than morphine and a place to die. Mustard gas, introduced later, brought a different kind of suffering. It was a blister agent absorbed through the skin as well as inhaled. Men exposed to it found their skin reeling within hours, then blistering, then sloughing off. The gas penetrated uniforms and masks. It attacked the eyes, causing temporary or permanent blindness. It settled into the soil and lingered for days. Entire sections of trench became uninhabitable. Medical reports describe men arriving at aid stations with faces so swollen they could not speak or open their mouths. Their eyelids fused shut with yellow pus, their skin peeling in strips. During a gas attack, trenches turned into confusion. Orders were shouted but not heard. Stretcher bearers moved blindly. Machine guns were silenced. Men pressed rags to their faces, urinated on scarves to create makeshift filters, or simply ran. Some tore off their masks in panic, gasping for clean air that wasn't there. Others froze, curled in corners with eyes shut, hands pressed to their mouths. In the worst cases, men thrashed in the mud like drowning animals, lungs filling with fluid as their comrades looked on helplessly. Gas masks improved over time, from simple gauze pads to full-face respirators with filters and valves, but they were far from perfect. In the early years, even trained soldiers found the masks disorienting. They fogged up quickly. The rubber was hot and stifling. Communication was impossible. Many soldiers described the sensation of wearing a mask as suffocating in itself, like being buried alive just to avoid death by air. After the attack passed, the effects lingered. The trench smelled of chemicals and rot. The gas, especially mustard, clung to clothing and skin. Men removed their uniforms and washed with cold water if they could. Most simply wiped themselves off with rags and hoped for the best. The wounded were evacuated by the dozens, their eyes bandaged, their lungs crackling with every breath. Many never returned to the line. Gas survivors were often easy to recognize later. Their lungs remained damaged. Their voices rasped. Some suffered from chronic coughing fits for the rest of their lives. Others went blind. A few lost the ability to speak altogether, their vocal cords scarred by acid. And still the war continued. Soldiers learned to live with the constant threat of gas. They slept with their masks hanging above their beds. They drilled for gas as often as they cleaned their rifles. Some began to recognize the subtle signs of wind direction, sudden silence from the enemy, a drifting haze along the ground. Superstition crept in. Some believed that the smell of bleach was a warning. Others swore by lucky charms tucked into their masks or helmets. By 1918, gas had become routine. The horror never faded, but the surprise did. It was simply one more way to die. The great irony was this. For all its terror, gas was responsible for a small percentage of battlefield deaths, then 3% of total casualties on the Western Front. But its psychological effect far outweighed its statistics. It made the air itself untrustworthy. It turned breath into danger. It blurred the lines between living and dying, between fighting and suffocating. And for those who endured it, the war never smelled the same again. Not all wounds of the Great War were visible. Some bled inward quietly, persistently shaping the rest of a man's life long after his uniform was folded away. These were wounds that had no scar, no bandage, no clear place to point and say, "Here is where I was injured." And in the early years of the war, few understood what to call them, but the soldiers did. They called it shell shock. The term first entered medical use in 1915 when British doctors began recording strange cases. Men who trembled uncontrollably, who could not speak, who wept for hours without reason or screamed at the sound of boots on gravel. Some went blind though their eyes were undamaged. Others lost the ability to stand or eat or sleep. Many developed violent tics, mutism, or paralysis that had no physical explanation. And most had one thing in common. They had recently survived artillery bombardment. Shell shock was originally believed to be caused by concussive force, the literal shaking of the brain inside the skull from nearby explosions. It seemed logical. Artillery was everywhere. Its noise was relentless. The shock waves rippled through the ground and air, slamming into bone and blood like invisible fists. But then came reports of soldiers suffering the same symptoms who had never been near an explosion. They had not been buried by a shell or thrown against a wall or even wounded, and yet they shook. They stammered. They could not return to the front. Some could not even walk. It became clear this was not a physical wound, or not only one. It was psychological trauma triggered by prolonged exposure to fear, death, and the inescapable pressure of industrial warfare. But in an era before the language of post-traumatic stress, these men were often misunderstood by doctors, officers, and even fellow soldiers. In the British Army, attitudes towards shell shock were divided. Some military physicians like Charles Myers treated it as a legitimate and serious condition. Others saw it as cowardice in disguise or convenient excuse for men who simply couldn't take the pressure. Treatment varied wildly. Some men were sent to convalescent homes for rest, therapy, and medical observation. Others were ordered back to the line. Still others were punished, tied to posts, denied food or court-martial. Over the course of the war, more than 80,000 cases of shell shock were officially recorded in the British Army alone. The true number was likely higher. In Germany, it was called Craneros. In France, commotion cerebral. Each army had its own language for the same breakdown, proof that it did not belong to one nation or temperament, but to the war itself. And yet, there was little sympathy. The Western Front did not allow for long-term recovery. Soldiers who showed signs of psychological collapse were often rotated out, patched up with rest and sedatives, and returned within days or weeks. Few could afford to lose able-bodied men. And so the war devoured them twice. Many broke during battle. During prolonged shelling, it was common for men to dig their fingers into the earth, eyes wide, rocking back and forth. Some curled into corners of dugouts, muttering to themselves. Others simply walked away from the front in a daze, unaware they were deserting. A small number became violent, striking officers, throwing away their rifles or refusing to obey orders. These were the most dangerous cases, not to others, but to themselves. In a few tragic instances, men suffering from shell shock were tried for desertion or cowardice and executed. Private Harry Farr, a 25-year-old from London, had served at the front since 1914. He collapsed repeatedly, unable to continue, and was shot in 1916. He had no legal representation. His wife later received a standard-issue telegram and a widow's pension. Farr's case was revisited almost a century later in 2006. He and 305 other British soldiers executed for military offenses during Vietnam were granted posthumous pardons by the British government. For those who lived, shell shock did not end with the armistice. Many returned home changed. Families spoke of once cheerful sons who now stared out of windows for hours, flinched at sudden noises, or cried in their sleep. Nightmares were common. Depression lingered. Some could not hold jobs. Some never spoke of the war again. Others could speak of nothing else. Medical understanding improved slowly. Shell shock was a foundational moment in the development of modern psychiatry. It forced military and civilian medicine alike to recognize that war did not only wound flesh, it damaged minds sometimes. Those wounds never healed. But in the trenches, amid the daily grind of mud and hunger and orders, there was no space for introspection. At night, when the guns finally fell silent and the flares stopped rising, and only the wind moved across no man's land, the men were left with their thoughts. And that, for many, was the most dangerous part. When the sun went down on the Western Front, the war did not end. It only changed shape. Darkness in the trenches was not a reprieve. It was a shift from open combat to the quieter, more intimate dangers that crept under the cover of night. The threat of artillery gave way to the hiss of a flare. Machine guns fell silent, but sniper fire continued. Men still died after sunset, just slower and often more quietly. There was no electricity, no lanterns, save for a few dimly shielded lamps in the dugouts. The trenches became a world of silhouettes, figures hunched against the wall, rifles stacked like bones, boots scraping along duckboards, slick with mud. The smell, always present, seemed to settle heavier in the cool air. Chlorine, sweat, cordite, wet wool, old blood. Nothing in nature smelled like it. Nothing ever would again. In some sections, the night began with Stand 2 all over again. Final check for surprise attacks at dusk, just as it had been at dawn. Men lined up on the fire step, bayonets fixed, eyes scanning a no-man's land they couldn't see. The procedure was mechanical, almost ceremonial. Most nights, nothing happened, but to skip it would be suicidal. Dawn and dusk were the enemy's favorite hours. After that came rations, the second meal of the day, if it arrived at all. Supply parties made their runs under the cloak of darkness, dragging crates of food, water, and sometimes letters from home. The most dangerous part of these trips wasn't the weight of the supplies. It was the silence required to carry them. One drop box, one shout, and the enemy might send over a mortar barrage to erase the entire effort. Many men were killed just trying to bring bread to the front line. Dinner was cold, usually cold bully beef, cold tea, cold hands. If a stove could be lit in a deep enough dugout, someone might heat a tin of stew. But hot food was a luxury. Most simply, chewed in the dark, helmets on, eyes flicking upward at every sound. Any sudden noise, a rat, a dropped rifle, the creak of a board could bring a rain of steel from above. Sleep, when it came, was taken in 2-hour shifts. Dugouts were crowded, ape and noisy. There was no bedding, only whatever padding a man could scourge. An extra coat, a sack of sand, a rolled-up tunic used as a pillow. Men slept sitting up, knees to their chest or lying flat in the dugout corner, boots still on, gas mask within arm's reach. On colder nights, they huddled together for warmth, not speaking, just breathing, just enduring. Sentries were posted throughout the night. Their job was simple and cruel: to watch the dark, to listen, to wait. If they failed, if they nodded off or missed a movement in the shadows, their unit might not live until morning. Some sentries cracked under the pressure. Others simply froze in place when the time came to shout. Both outcomes had consequences. Beyond the wire, the enemy moved to night patrols, crawled into no man's land in small teams, sometimes to repair barbed wire, sometimes to sabotage the enemies, sometimes just to listen. These missions were among the most dangerous in the war. A single misstep could reveal their position. If caught, there was no rescue. Many patrols disappeared and were never seen again. Their names were added to casualty rolls marked presumed dead. The silence of night was not real silence. It was layered. There were the sounds of shovels digging new trenches, of water being passed along the line in battered canteens, of men whispering about home, about food, about the next attack. There were groans from the wounded, low and steady, the occasional scream, abrupt and brief, when a man's nerves finally failed him. And above it all, the constant rustling of rats, unbothered by bullets or shot. Oh, bananas. Thriving in the filth. Sometimes the men wrote letters. They did it by candlelight on scrap paper with pencils sharpened by knife. The words were careful, censored, always optimistic. We're holding the line. Don't worry about me. The food's not bad. What they didn't say, couldn't say, was that they hadn't washed in weeks, hadn't slept properly in days, and had seen friends turned inside out by high explosive. And yet, the writing helped. It created a bridge between the trench and the world beyond it. A reminder that they were not only soldiers, but sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. That there was something beyond the wire, something worth crawling toward. When the candles burned down and the letters were sealed, most men tried to sleep again. If they were lucky, the guns stayed quiet. If they weren't, morning would come early in fire, in shouting, in the whistle that meant the war had started again. Survival in the trenches of the First World War was rarely a victory. It was a condition, a question answered differently every day. The cost was not measured only in limbs lost or blood spilled, but in the slow wearing away of the soul, A soldier who survived a full day at the front, who endured this gas. The shells, the lice, the hunger, the fear, and the orders did not come away unchanged. Even in moments of stillness, the war lingered. It was in the damp of their clothes, in the tremor of their hands, in the ringing silence left by explosions. The body could heal. The nerves might not. Some called it luck. To wake up in the same trench you fell asleep in, to return from patrol, to make it back from the wire. But over time, luck took on another meaning. It was not surviving an attack, it was being sent back home. Wounded, gassed, shell-shocked, invalided out. That many believed was true survival and exit. Not an escape from duty, but from the slow certainty of attrition. Because eventually every soldier knew their time would come. The average life expectancy of a frontline soldier on the Western Front in some sectors was measured in weeks. In places like the Somme or Passchendaele, a newly rotated battalion could expect casualty rates of 50 to 70% within days. Entire towns back in Britain and France lost generations. Brothers were buried in the same mud, just trenches apart. Friends disappeared in clouds of earth, never found, never named. And yet the men stayed, not for glory. The war had burned that away by 1915. Not for medals either. Though they were awarded, pinned, and saluted, they meant little compared to the weight of memory. Most soldiers stayed because they had no choice. Orders were orders. Cowardice was punished. And desertion, real or suspected, was met with a rifle squad at dawn. But beyond that, they stayed for each other. The trenches broke men, but they also bound them. Comradeship became a lifeline. The man who shared his last biscuit, who dragged you from a crater, who lit your cigarette after Stianu, he mattered more than kings or causes. In the strangest way, the war created a kind of family shaped not by blood, but by fire and earth and cold. When the war finally ended, November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, many of those who survived found the silence more jarring than the guns. Peace arrived not with cheers, but with confusion. What now? What comes next? After 4 years of digging, marching, killing, watching, waiting. For many, the answer was nothing. They went home to quiet streets and unfamiliar honors. They could not describe where they had been, what they had seen. The war had changed its survivors in ways that didn't show in photographs. Some took to farming, some drank, some wrote books, some said nothing at all. Governments called them heroes. Newspapers printed parades. Statues were raised. But in the hearts of those who had lived it, the war was not a clean thing, not a victory or a loss. It was a memory soaked into the skin like trench mataways there. Always damp, always waiting. And for many, the true toll of survival was this, that they had lived long enough to remember. Thank you for listening to this episode of Boring History for Sleep. Wherever you're listening from tonight, may your trench be dry, your rations warm, and your dreams quiet. Thank you. Music, back to top AI features. Feedback, transform your transcript with AI-powered insights. Output language, AI responses will be in this language: English, Spanish, Espanol, French, Francais,